Have you ever heard of Operation Barbarossa? Did you know that it is considered by many historians as the greatest military failure in the history of mankind? In this video, we will dive into the details of Operation Barbarossa and tell you why it is so important. It was planned and carried out by Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany. These included the belief that the Soviet Union was weak and could be defeated quickly, that the German army was invincible, and that the Soviet people would welcome the German invasion as a liberation from communism. Hitler also hoped that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly, allowing him to focus on other fronts, such as Great Britain. German troops crossed the Soviet border and began advancing in three directions. The Soviets had been expecting an invasion by Germany and had prepared defensive positions along the Soviet-German border. Additionally, the Soviets had a much larger army than the Germans and were able to replenish their ranks quickly. As a result, the German advance slowed down and the fighting became increasingly costly in terms of lives and equipment. Army Group North moved toward Leningrad, Army Group Center targeted Moscow, and Army Group South headed to Ukraine. The German army was a highly mobile force that relied on speed and maneuverability to achieve its goals. However, as the German advance continued, their supply lines became stretched thin and they were unable to keep up with the demands of the troops. This led to shortages of food, ammunition, and other supplies, which in turn weakened the German forces. By September, the Germans were nearing Moscow and Leningrad. However, the Soviet resistance was fierce and the Germans were unable to make any further significant gains. The failure of Operation Barbarossa had profound consequences for the course of World War II and the fate of Germany and the world. First, the Soviets were better prepared than the Germans expected. They had strong defensive positions and a large army that was able to hold off the German attacks. Did you know that many high-ranking German officers opposed the invasion of the Soviet Union? The military setbacks and the realization that the Soviet Union could not be defeated quickly led to tension and power struggles within the Nazi Party. Some argue that the invasion of the Soviet Union was a necessary and even justified move to protect Germany's interests and security. Others contend that it was a disastrous mistake that led to the downfall of Nazi Germany and the needless loss of millions of lives. Eventually, Hitler's authority was challenged and he was forced to commit suicide in 1945. The Nazi propaganda machine portrayed the Soviet Union as an evil empire that was oppressing its people and that Germany was going to liberate them. Many Germans who fought in the invasion believed this propaganda and did not realize that Germany was actually planning to conquer and exploit the Soviet Union. They believed that it was a risky and unnecessary move that would divert Germany's limited resources and manpower away from more important fronts, such as Great Britain. Their concerns were ultimately ignored and the invasion went forward as planned. The German losses included over 350,000 military personnel killed, wounded, or captured, over 3,000 tanks and other armored vehicles, over 2,500 aircraft, and hundreds of ships and boats. The German economy was severely damaged due to the cost of the war, and the country's ability to wage war was greatly diminished. Additionally, the loss of skilled German soldiers and the destruction of German military equipment and infrastructure made it difficult for Germany to continue fighting. Despite these setbacks, Hitler refused to end the war and continued to pursue his goals of conquering the Soviet Union and Great Britain. However, without the resources and manpower to support a prolonged war, Germany's position became increasingly desperate and the country ultimately suffered a decisive defeat. The Soviet losses were even higher, with an estimated 1 million military personnel killed or wounded, thousands of tanks, aircraft, and other military equipment lost. The invasion of the Soviet Union had a devastating impact on both sides, and the fighting continued for several years until Germany's eventual defeat in 1945. Second, The Germans did not prepare for the harsh Russian winter, and their troops suffered greatly from the cold weather. Finally, the German military was overextended, and their supply lines could not keep up with the demands of the troops. All of these factors contributed to the ultimate failure of Operation Barbarossa. In fact, the Soviets began launching counterattacks and pushing the Germans back from their positions. The German army was well equipped and highly trained, and they quickly made significant gains against the Soviets. By mid-July, the Germans had captured large areas of Soviet territory, including the Baltic states, Belarus, and Ukraine. They also captured many Soviet soldiers and forced them to join the German army as auxiliary troops. The operation began on June 22, 1941, and lasted until December 1941. The goal of the invasion was to conquer the Soviet Union. The German army, known as the Wehrmacht, consisted of three parts: Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group South. Each group was responsible for invading and conquering a different part of the Soviet Union. The Germans had not prepared for the extreme cold, and their troops were not properly equipped to survive in sub-zero temperatures. This, combined with the stiff Soviet resistance, led to the eventual collapse of the German offensive. The German Air Force, known as the Luftwaffe, played a key role in the operation, providing air support to the ground forces and bombing Soviet cities and military targets. This assumption was based on a number of factors, including the belief that the Soviet people would welcome the Germans as liberators and that the Soviet army was weak. However, both of these assumptions proved to be false. The Soviet people resisted the German occupation, and the Soviet army proved to be a formidable opponent. The German Navy and U-boats also played a role in the invasion by cutting off Soviet supplies and communications with the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, and its resources, including oil, grain, and raw materials such as timber and minerals. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union was a threat to Germany's security, and that conquering it would provide Germany with the living space, or Lebensraum, it needed to survive. Additionally, he believed that the Soviet Union's vast natural resources would help Germany sustain its war effort. So sit back and get ready to learn about one of the most significant events in World War II. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany during World War II. The plan for Operation Barbarossa was developed by the German military and was based on a number of assumptions. In order to achieve its goals, Operation Barbarossa involved a massive military campaign. The invasion of the Soviet Union began on June 22, 1941, with a massive surprise attack. However, as the summer progressed, the Germans began to face stiff resistance from the Soviet army. Despite the setbacks, Hitler was determined to conquer the Soviet Union, and he continued to push his troops eastward. One of the key factors in the eventual failure of Operation Barbarossa was the harsh Russian winter. Another factor that contributed to the failure of Operation Barbarossa was the German belief that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. Finally, the failure of Operation Barbarossa can also be attributed to the fact that the German military was overextended. So, what are the main reasons for the failure of Operation Barbarossa? Well, there are a few key factors. And when it comes to the casualties of Operation Barbarossa, the numbers are staggering. After the failure of Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany entered a period of decline. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union is widely regarded as one of the most catastrophic military blunders in history. Now let's talk about some interesting facts related to Operation Barbarossa that you might not know. Another interesting fact is that the German people were not fully informed about the true nature and goals of the invasion. Moreover, the failure of Operation Barbarossa had a significant impact on the leadership of Nazi Germany. Today, the legacy of Operation Barbarossa continues to be debated and discussed by historians. Regardless of how you view Operation Barbarossa, there is no doubt that it was a pivotal moment in the history of the 20th century and had a profound impact on the world we live in today. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Thank you for watching.